Usually when we talk about a legal code
Yeah.
or a diagnostic manual or really any system of rules, there is this underlying expectation of precision.
Right.
We want it to be like engineering.
Sure.
I mean, if you break your arm, the doctor takes an x-ray. That x-ray shows a jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the break.
Yeah, the human mind craves that binary. We want to know if something is valid or invalid.
Exactly. Legal or illegal.
Right, broken or whole. It's comforting to have things categorized into neat, predictable little boxes.
But the moment you step out of the physical world of broken bones and, well, step into the world of human behavior, of societal obligations, and especially of intent.
Oh, intent is the hardest part.
Right. Suddenly the x-ray machine is completely useless. We're looking at a landscape that just isn't black and white. It is incredibly frustratingly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And nowhere is that friction more apparent than when a legal system attempts to regulate the invisible internal landscape of human intention. I mean, how do you legislate what someone is feeling in their heart when they perform a physical action?
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. If you're listening with us today, we're taking a journey into a stack of sources from classical Islamic jurisprudence.
Specifically, an excerpt known as the Book of Sacrifice, or Kitab al-Udhiyah.
Right, and I need to set the expectations right out of the gate for you listening, because when I first saw this title in our source pile, my immediate thought was, okay, this is going to be a dry, medieval, step-by-step manual about how to process livestock for an annual holiday.
You expected a butcher's guide.
I really did. A butcher's guide with a religious veneer.
Well, I don't blame you for that assumption. On its surface, the text describes the physical mechanics of an ancient ritual.
Yeah.
But what lies beneath that surface is a masterclass in legal theory.
That is, honestly, the understatement of the year. What we actually have here is a profound window into socioeconomics, human psychology, and really the fundamental tension of any justice system.
Yes, the tension between strict, literal law and pragmatic, human-centered equity.
Right, which they call qiyas for strict analogy and istitsan for equity.
Those two concepts, qiyas and istihsan, are going to be the absolute anchors of everything we discuss today, because the jurists who compiled this text hundreds of years ago weren't just thinking about sheep and cows.
No, they were building a comprehensive legal architecture.
Exactly. They were asking, how do you balance the rigid mathematical logic of a legal code with the messy, unpredictable, practical realities of everyday human life?
I want to make sure we are completely grounded in those two terms before we take another step. Walk me through qiyas first, because the translation we have is strict analogy, but how does that actually function in this legal mindscape?
Think of qiyas as the algorithm of the classical legal system. It is pure deductive logic. So if the law says A equals B and you encounter a new situation, C, that is identical in its fundamental characteristics to A, then C must also equal B.
Makes sense.
It is the blind application of precedent and logical deduction, regardless of how uncomfortable the outcome might be. It ensures that the law is consistent and not just based on a judge's personal whim.
So it's the cold, hard letter of the law. It's the fine print.
Precisely. But the brilliant jurists of this era, particularly within the Hanafi school of thought that dominates our source text, they recognized a fatal flaw in relying solely on qiyas.
Because life isn't an algorithm.
Right. Sometimes, taking a perfectly logical rule to its absolute mathematical extreme creates a result that is absurd or excessively harsh or completely contradicts the broader spirit of justice and ease that the religion is supposed to champion.
And that's where the second concept comes in to save the day. Istihsan.
Istihsan literally translates to juristic preference or finding something to be good.
Finding something to be good. I like that.
In practice, it is the legal release valve. It is the doctrine of equity. It allows a jurist to step in and say, look, I know the strict logical formula of qiyas dictates that we should penalize this person or invalidate this contract.
Yeah.
But doing so would cause undue hardship. It would break the society we are trying to regulate. Therefore, I am legally preferring a different ruling to maintain fairness and pragmatism.
It's the judge looking up from the rulebook, looking at the actual human being standing in the courtroom, and saying, we need to bend this rule so it doesn't break you.
Yes. And as we dig into this text, you are going to see these medieval scholars constantly wrestling between the comfort of qiyas and the necessity of istihsan.
We are going to look at how a society defines a civic and religious obligation. how they manage the syndication of shared assets, and how they create a legal standard that accommodates the destitute poor without letting the wealthy off the hook.
It is so deeply relevant to how we structure laws today.
It really is. So to even begin analyzing a legal code, you first have to establish jurisdiction. You have to ask who is actually bound by this. And that brings us to the first major debate in our sources.
The sheer weight of the obligation itself.
Right. The text opens not with a unified consensus, but with a heavy intellectual brawl among the top legal minds of the era.
We are talking about the founders of the major schools of thought. Abu Hanifa and his prominent students on one side, and scholars from other traditions like al-Shafi'i on another.
The core of the argument revolves around a single massive question. Is this annual sacrifice a strict legal obligation with a term of wajib, or is it just a highly recommended tradition and emphasized sunnah?
To understand the stakes of that debate, we have to understand what those classifications mean in this specific legal framework.
Break that down for us, because to my modern ear, obligation and highly recommended sound like a debate over semantics.
In this context, it is the difference between a minor misstep and a grave dereliction of duty. If an act is declared wajib or obligatory, it means it is an absolute requirement for anyone who meets the criteria.
Okay.
If you have the means to do it and you deliberately skip it, you are considered legally and spiritually culpable. You have accrued a debt.
You're in serious trouble.
Yes. On the other hand, if an act is declared an emphasized sunnah, it means it is a powerful tradition. It is the established practice of the Prophet.
Though it's good to do.
It is highly, highly encouraged, and you are rewarded for doing it. But, and this is the crucial legal distinction, you are not fundamentally penalized or considered a sinner for failing to perform it.
I was trying to think of a modern equivalent to map this onto. It feels like the difference between a civic expectation, like, say, voting in a local election, versus a hard legal mandate, like filing your income taxes.
That is an excellent analogy.
If you don't vote, people might think you're a bad citizen, you might feel guilty, but the police aren't going to show up at your door. If you don't pay your taxes, well, you are going to face the full weight of the legal system.
The debate is over whether this act is the civic vote or the income tax. And what is so fascinating about the source material is how these brilliant jurists argue their opposing positions.
Yeah, because they're looking at the same text.
They are looking at the exact same historical reports, the exact same quotes from the Prophet, but they are applying entirely different legal and linguistic microscopes to them.
Right. Let's look at the Sunnah argument first.
Yeah.
The camp that says this is just highly recommended. You've got massive intellectual heavyweights, like Abu Yusuf in one specific narration, al-Shafi'i.
Yes.
They point to a specific quote from the Prophet that says, "Whoever wants to sacrifice from among you, let him not take anything from his hair and nails." They build their entire defense around that single word, wants.
It is a phenomenal piece of linguistic deduction. Al-Shafi'i looks at the phrasing, whoever wants to, or in some translations, whoever intends to. He argues that if a legislator is laying down a strict, non-negotiable legal mandate, they do not condition it on the emotional desire or the voluntary will of the citizen.
Right. Going back to the tax analogy, the IRS does not put out a memo saying, whoever wants to pay their income tax this year, please make sure you fill out a W-2.
Exactly. The presence of the choice implies the absence of a mandate. Al-Shafi'i's logic is that tying the act to the person's will inherently contradicts the very definition of a mandatory obligation. It must, therefore, be a sunnah, a highly encouraged choice.
It makes total logical sense. But then you turn the page, and Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school, and his top students, Muhammad and Zufar, come back swinging.
They take the hardline stance.
They argue it is wajib. It is a strict obligation.
Yeah.
And they bring their own textual evidence to the table, and honestly, it sounds terrifying.
They point to a rather stark, uncompromising warning issued by the Prophet. Whoever has the means and does not sacrifice, let him not approach our prayer place.
That is heavy. Let him not approach our prayer place. That isn't just a slap on the wrist.
No, it's not.
In the context of a medieval community, where the congregational Eid prayer is the absolute center of social, spiritual, and civic life, being banned from that gathering is essentially social exile.
It is spiritual quarantine. And Abu Hanifa's legal reasoning is rooted in the proportionality of the threat. His argument is that a lawgiver does not issue a threat of social and spiritual exclusion for simply skipping a recommended tradition.
Where you don't banish someone from the communal square because they failed to do something optional.
Exactly. The punishment has to fit the crime. That specific level of severity, that explicit threat of alienation, mathematically implies that a fundamental obligation has been breached. Therefore, logically, it must be wajid.
I am amazed by how much legal weight they place on the syntax of these ancient quotes. But okay, despite this fierce debate over the exact legal weight of the act, both sides eventually agree on certain baseline criteria for the person who is supposed to be doing it.
Yes, the taxpayer or the voter, so to speak.
Right. Whether you think it's the income tax or the civic vote, you still have to define who that person is.
The text outlines 3 strict conditions for the obligation to attach to a person. They must be a free person, meaning not enslaved, because an enslaved person does not have full legal ownership of property.
Okay.
They must be a Muslim, as this is a specific religious rite, and crucially, they must be a resident.
Meaning travelers are completely exempt from this entire process. And this exemption completely fascinated me because it reveals so much about how they viewed the intersection of physical reality and legal duty.
The traveler exemption is a profound point of equity in this legal code. The text explicitly compares the act of sacrifice to other major duties, like the Friday congregational prayer. These are obligations that inherently require geographic and social stability.
But I want to push back on this a little bit because my modern brain is struggling with it.
Yeah.
If I am a billionaire and I happen to be on a business trip to Tokyo on the day of a religious holiday, I'm still a billionaire. I still have the money. Why does stepping onto an airplane, or in their case a caravan, suddenly absolve me of a religious duty that is tied to my wealth?
That is the exact question a strict Kias logician would ask.
Right.
But you have to strip away your modern context. You have to forget about digital wallets, wire transfers, and instantaneous global commerce.
Okay, I'm back in the 8th century.
In the medieval legal framework, wealth isn't just a number on a ledger that exists in the ether. Wealth is defined by your immediate physical access to and control over your assets.
Oh, I see.
You could be the wealthiest merchant in Damascus. You could own vast estates and chests of gold. But if you are currently traveling through the harsh desert, weeks away from home, the gold sitting in your vault in Damascus does absolutely nothing to help you acquire a sheep in the middle of nowhere.
So your capacity is limited to what is currently in your saddlebags.
More than that, travel in the pre-modern world was inherently an act of vulnerability and hardship. The law recognizes the physical and logistical limitations of the human being in transit.
Which is incredibly burdensome if you are living out of a tent and constantly on the move.
It is an unreasonable demand. And the text provides historical precedent for this pragmatism. It notes that major early figures, like the caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar, intentionally did not perform the sacrifice when they were traveling.
Wait, really? The leaders of the empire just skipped it?
They did it deliberately, in front of people, specifically to establish this legal precedent. They were demonstrating, through their own actions, that the divine law should not ask the impossible, or even the highly inconvenient, of someone in a vulnerable state of transit.
It is a built-in mercy.
Exactly. The obligation pauses when your stability pauses.
Okay, that makes perfect sense when you understand the physical reality of ancient travel. So the obligation requires you to be free, resident, and, well, wealthy.
Having the means.
We've thrown that word around a lot. But how on earth does a legal code define wealthy? Because wealth is incredibly subjective. Someone who makes $50,000 a year might feel rich compared to someone making 20, but poor compared to a millionaire.
The jurists despise subjectivity. Subjectivity leads to unequal application of the law. They needed a hard, measurable, objective threshold, a financial line in the sand.
So where did they draw it?
They didn't invent a new metric. To maintain internal consistency within their massive legal system, they tied the wealth requirement for the sacrifice to the exact same threshold required for a completely different area of law, the Sadaqat al-Fitr.
Remind me what that is.
A Sadaqat al-Fitr is the obligatory charity given at the very end of the fasting month of Ramadan. The law had already established a highly specific mathematical threshold for who is required to give that charity.
Okay.
It basically calculates whether you possess a certain amount of surplus wealth. Specifically, wealth that exceeds your basic life necessities. It doesn't count the house you live in, the clothes on your back, or the tools you need for your trade. It looks at your surplus.
I see. So they just ported that existing definition over.
Precisely. They created a unified theory of financial capability. If you have enough surplus assets that the law considers you wealthy enough to be mandated to give the Ramadan charity, then you are officially categorized as wealthy enough to be obligated to perform the annual sacrifice.
The legal status of your wallet is consistent across the board.
Exactly.
I love the efficiency of that. But establishing that threshold leads to what I think is the most mind-bending debate in this first section of our sources. Because it's one thing to look at an adult's bank account, but what happens when we bring dependents into the picture?
Oh, the minor's wealth.
Yes. What happens when a wealthy father has a minor child, and that child actually has their own independent wealth?
This is a phenomenal scenario.
It reads like a modern trust fund dilemma. Say a grandparent passes away and leaves the significant inheritance directly to a 7-year-old child.
Right.
The child's net worth now exceeds the legal threshold of wealth we just talked about. Does the father, acting as the guardian, have to go out and buy a sacrifice on behalf of the child, using the child's own inherited money?
This debate is one of the clearest examples in the text of the friction between fiduciary duty and religious obligation. And again, the giants of the Hanafi school are completely split on this.
Walk me through the arguments, because I can see valid points on both sides. On one hand, you want to ensure the child fulfills their spiritual duties. On the other, you shouldn't be raiding a kid's piggy bank.
Let's start with Abu Hanifa, and in one narration, his student Abu Yusuf. They argue that yes, if the minor child possesses the qualifying amount of wealth, the guardian is legally required to perform the sacrifice from the child's own assets.
What is their underlying logic? Why dip into the minor's funds?
Because they view the sacrifice primarily as a financial obligation tied inherently to the presence of wealth. It is a toll on surplus capital.
A toll.
They use qiyas, strict analogy, linking it back to that Ramadan charity, the sadaqat afit. A guardian is required to pay the Ramadan charity out of a wealthy child's assets because the wealth itself triggers the duty.
Okay, I follow that.
Therefore, Abu Hanifa argues, the same logic applies here. The wealth exists, the obligation exists, and the guardian is merely executing an administrative duty on behalf of the estate.
It's treating the child's wealth as a taxable entity, regardless of the child's age. But the text says that his other top students, Muhammad and Zufar, and the entirety of the Shafi school, vehemently and forcefully disagree with this.
They push back against their own teacher entirely. They argue that the father must pay for any sacrifice for the child out of his own pocket, or, in some views, there is simply no obligation on the minor at all.
They construct a massive legal firewall around the child's money.
Exactly.
I'm naturally inclined to agree with them. But how do they dismantle Abu Hanifa's logic about the toll on wealth?
They argue that Abu Hanifa is miscategorizing the fundamental nature of the act. They say, look closely at what is actually happening. The core indispensable element of this act is pure worship, the symbolic shedding of blood to draw nearer to the divine.
The financial aspect is secondary.
The financial aspect, the buying of the animal and the charity of giving away the meat, is a secondary byproduct.
Okay, so it's worship first, economics second.
Exactly. And here is their crucial legal principle. You cannot legally deplete a minor's financial assets for an act of pure, intentional worship that the child is not mentally or legally capable of intending or understanding.
Wow.
A guardian has a strict fiduciary duty. Their sole job is to protect, preserve, and grow the child's wealth until they reach maturity. They do not have the right to spend the child's money on spiritual acts that the child cannot consent to.
That is profound.
The text provides a remarkably practical justification for this. It says, the minor cannot eat all of it.
What does that mean in this context?
It means that if you take the child's money and buy a sheep and then slaughter the sheep, the child is not receiving a commensurate material benefit for the destruction of their asset.
Right, the kid can't eat a whole sheep.
Much of it will be given away or eaten by others. Therefore, from a strict accounting perspective, the guardian has taken the child's gold and turned it into an unrecoverable material loss for the child's estate. Legally, a guardian cannot authorize a loss. Therefore, you cannot touch the kid's money for this.
That is just brilliant. It is a hardcore financial ethics ruling embedded inside a religious manual. It prioritizes the worldly protection of the vulnerable minor over imposing a premature spiritual burden on them.
It demonstrates that these jurists were not just religious ideologues. They were deeply pragmatic legal scholars, ensuring that spiritual zeal didn't override basic economic justice.
And this theme of economic reality, the sheer cost of things, transitions us perfectly into the next major dilemma in our sources, because we've spent all this time establishing that the obligation hinges on having a certain amount of wealth.
Right.
But wealth is a spectrum. What happens when a person technically meets the threshold of being wealthy, but the physical animal they're required to buy, like a massive cow or a camel, is just too expensive for one person to afford on their own?
The law recognizes that market forces matter. If the law demands a sacrifice, but the market price of livestock is too high for an individual, the law has to provide a mechanism to prevent people from falling into debt just to fulfill a religious duty.
So they invented the religious joint venture.
They allowed for syndication. You can form a legal partnership to purchase and sacrifice a single larger animal.
The text lays out the mathematics of this syndication very clearly at first. The baseline rule is 1 sheep or 1 goat equals a sacrifice for exactly 1 person. You cannot split a sheep.
Correct.
But if you move up a weight class, a cow or a camel can legally cover up to 7 individuals.
Up to 7 independent people can pool their funds, buy 1 cow, and each claim a 1/7 of the spiritual reward and the physical meat.
Now, I want to pause here, because based on everything we've talked about regarding strict logic, Kias, this mathematical ratio makes absolutely no sense.
You are thinking like a medieval jurist. Tell me why it makes no sense to you.
Because if the core of the act, as the firewall argument for the miner's wealth just established, is the singular symbolic shedding of blood,
Yes.
then 1 death equals 1 sacrifice, period. A cow shedding its blood is 1 event. A sheep shedding its blood is 1 event. Why does the cow's single death suddenly count for 7 people?
Exactly.
Strict analogy should say 1 animal, 1 person, regardless of tonnage.
That is exactly the argument of Kies. And what is remarkable about our source text is that the jurists explicitly admit that you are right. The text states, and I quote, "The strict analogy is that it should not be valid except for 1 person, because the shedding of blood is a single act that cannot be divided."
So they acknowledge that their own logical algorithm breaks here.
They do, but then the text continues, "except that we abandon this analogy due to the transmitted report."
Meaning they found a historical text that overrides their own logic.
Exactly. They cite a specific, verified narration from Jabir, a companion of the prophet, who explicitly recorded the historical practice. "We sacrificed with the messenger of God a cow on behalf of 7 and a camel on behalf of 7.
So historical precedent creates a legal exception to pure logic.
Yes. It's an acknowledgement that while logic is a vital tool for expanding the law, the direct actions of the prophet form the immovable bedrock of the law. If the prophet did it, the logic must bow to the practice.
But the text notes that not everyone agrees on this math. It mentions that the Maliki school of thought approaches this entirely differently. They don't do the math by individual head counts, they do it by households.
The Malikis rely on a different historical narration that states, "Upon every household, every year, is a sacrifice." Therefore, they argue that a single animal, even a single sheep, can legally cover an entire family unit, regardless of whether that family consists of 3 people or 20 people living under 1 roof.
That feels a lot more communal. But the Hanafi text we are analyzing pushes back on that interpretation.
The Hanafis interpret the word household in that narration not as a collective blanket, but as referring to the specific individual within the household who possesses the qualifying wealth, usually the head of the family.
So they keep the math strict.
They maintain the hard mathematical limit. A cow can be split by a maximum of 7 people. You can do 3 people, you can do 5, you can do exactly 7, but you cannot do 8.
Okay, so let's say I gather 6 of my friends. We are all wealthy enough to be obligated. We pool our money, and we buy a magnificent cow. Sounds like an incredibly practical way to fulfill the duty and stock our freezers.
Right.
But here is where the text introduces a rule that absolutely blew my mind.
Fair.
I call it the deal breaker rule. And it entirely revolves around the psychology of the partners.
This is where the law transitions from regulating physical property to regulating the unseen world of shared human intent, and it is arguably the most fragile legal arrangement in the entire book.
The rule states that if 7 people form a partnership to share a cow, every single person in that partnership must possess the specific intention of religious worship. The Arabic term used is korba, the desire to draw near to God.
Correct. The intention must be unified in its broader spiritual direction. The text allows for some variance. Maybe you are doing the annual obligatory sacrifice, and I am doing a voluntary sacrifice to celebrate a newborn child,
Okay.
and a third partner is fulfilling a specific religious vow they made. That is legally permissible because all 3 of those intentions fall under the umbrella of korba. They are all acts of worship.
But what if they aren't? The text presents a scenario. What if 6 of us are doing this for deeply spiritual reasons to fulfill our legal obligation?
Right.
But the seventh partner we bring in is just a buddy of ours who loves barbecue.
Right.
He doesn't care about the holiday. He just really wants to secure a massive amount of premium beef at a wholesale price. Or, the text mentions, what if the seventh partner is a non-Muslim who obviously doesn't share the Islamic spiritual intent at all? What happens then?
If that happens, the sacrifice is legally invalid for all 7 partners.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you there because my modern brain is aggressively rejecting this. You're telling me that all of them fail.
Yes.
My deeply held spiritual obligation, my financial investment, is completely nullified because the guy who chipped in for the left hindquarter just wanted to make a brisket.
Yes, that's exactly what it means.
That is absurd. It seems incredibly harsh and completely violates the concept of individual responsibility. Why can't the law just prorate the cow? Why can't the judge say, okay, the cow is 85% holy and 15% secular. The 6 of you are fine. The 7th guy just gets his meat.
Because you cannot prorate a consecration. The jurists are operating on a profound metaphysical and philosophical principle here, the absolute indivisibility of the act of sacrifice.
I need you to unpack that because I am still fighting for the 6 guys who lost their money.
Think about the physical reality of what is happening. The act of sacrifice is not the distribution of the meat afterward. The core religious act is the singular moment of consecration and the shedding of the animal's blood. That moment is a single, indivisible event in time and space.
Okay, I follow that.
You cannot compartmentalize a single death. You cannot say to the divine, please accept the first 6/7 of this blood as a holy offering, but please ignore the final 7th of the blood because that part is just for a barbecue. It is an all or nothing proposition.
It's a binary state. The animal is either wholly sacred or it isn't.
Exactly. I'll use an analogy. Imagine you have a glass of the purest crystal clear water. 6 people each pour in another drop of pure water. The 7th person comes along and pours in a single drop of black ink.
The whole glass is tinted.
You can't unmix it. You can't extract the ink and say the rest is still pure. The secular, worldly intention of that one partner fundamentally alters the molecular structure of the shared action. It pulls the entire event out of the realm of pure worship and introduces a worldly, commercial element into the very core of the consecration.
Wow.
Because the law demands absolute purity of intent for the obligation to be fulfilled, the presence of that ink corrupts the ritual for everyone involved.
That is a staggering level of communal interdependence.
Yeah.
It really forces you to deeply vet the people you are going into business with, even religious business.
It forces a highly conscious, deliberate community. You cannot be casual about who you partner with in acts of worship.
But the jurists weren't entirely rigid logicians sitting in ivory towers. They understood that the practical realities of the livestock market could make this rule a nightmare to execute.
Yes, and this brings us to one of the most brilliant practical applications of istism, that concept of juristic preference and equity we talked about earlier.
This is a perfect example of the law bending to accommodate the messiness of human reality.
So walk me through the scenario of buying the cow first, because it highlights exactly how strict logic can accidentally create an impossible situation.
Imagine you go to the bustling livestock market a week before the holiday. You haven't organized a syndicate yet. You don't have 6 partners lined up, but while you're walking around, you see it. The most magnificent, healthy, beautifully fattened cow in the entire market. It is absolute perfection.
You don't want to lose it to another buyer.
Exactly.
Oh.
So you pull out your purse and you buy the cow entirely with your own money, and in your heart, you make the explicit intention, this cow is my dedicated sacrifice for the upcoming holiday.
Okay, the transaction is complete. You own the cow,
Yeah.
and you have spiritually designated it.
Right. But then you get it home, tie it up in your yard, and reality sets in. This cow is massive. This is way too much meat for my family, and frankly, I spent way too much money. I need to offset this cost. So the next day, you go to the local coffee house, find 6 of your wealthy friends, and say, hey, I bought this amazing cow. Do you guys want to buy shares in it and make it a joint sacrifice?
It sounds incredibly reasonable. It's just retroactive syndication.
According to the strict, unyielding logic of Kies, it is absolutely, unequivocally forbidden.
Forbidden? Why? You own the cow.
Ah, but do you? This is where the logic is razor sharp. The jurist Zufar, who is the champion of strict analogy in this text, lays out the argument. The moment you purchase that cow with the explicit intention of it being a religious sacrifice, you fundamentally changed its legal status.
Yeah.
You consecrated it. You've essentially dedicated that specific physical asset to God.
Okay, so it's not entirely yours anymore?
Because it is now consecrated property, It is no longer entirely your worldly, commercial asset to freely trade. By turning around and selling 6/7 of that cow to your friends, you're essentially engaging in a retail commercial transaction using an asset that belongs to the divine realm. Zufar says it is invalid. You cannot sell shares of a consecrated item.
I have to admit, logically, Zufar is completely right.
He is.
If I donate a rare painting to a museum, I can't show up a week later and try to sell shares of that painting to my friends to recoup my donation cost. The museum already owns the painting. The legal logic tracks perfectly.
The logic is flawless. It is intellectually watertight, but practically, it's a disaster.
Because it is really, really hard to perfectly coordinate the schedules, the finances, and the intentions of 7 different busy adults before you even set foot in a chaotic farmer's market.
Exactly. If you enforce Zufar's strict TS, you are demanding an unreasonable level of administrative foresight from average citizens. You are making the act of worship practically inaccessible for people who rely on sharing costs but can't organize a committee meeting before going shopping.
And here's where the heroes of equity step in.
The majority of the Hanafi jurists look at Zufar's flawless logic and they use Istisan to override it. They issue a ruling that, yes, despite the strict analogy, this retroactive partnership is legally permitted.
How do they justify breaking the logical rule?
They explicitly cite the sociological reality. I'll paraphrase the text, but the sentiment is clear. A person might find a fat cow to buy at the market, but not find partners at the exact time of the sale. They may only find these partners later. The human need for this flexibility is pressing, and enforcing the strict rule causes undue difficulty. Therefore, we permit it to remove hardship.
To remove hardship. That is such a powerful legal doctrine. They are openly acknowledging that if the pure mathematical deduction of the law creates an unreasonable burden on the average citizen, then the law has failed its primary purpose.
This is the hallmark of a mature, sophisticated legal system. A rigid, brittle system breaks under the weight of human reality. A mature system has a built-in shock absorber. Istisan is that shock absorber. It allows a jurist to say, the algorithm points to X, but X ruins the intended ease of the law. Therefore, we will legally prefer Y.
Though I did notice the text adds a little bit of a wagging finger at the end of that ruling. It says, it is better to do this, finding partners, before the purchase to be further from disagreement.
It's the medieval equivalent of saying, we are giving you this loophole because we know life is messy, but please don't make a habit of playing fast and loose with consecrated property if you can avoid it. Try to be organized.
I love that. We'll allow it, but we don't love it.
Okay, so we've got the people sorted out. We know who has to do it. We know how they can team up to afford it. And we know they all have to have pure intentions. But setting up the partnership is only half the battle. The actual timing of when this event takes place is highly regulated.
And this brings us to what I think is the most surprising sociological revelation in the text.
You are referring to how the law handles geography.
Yes. Because as I was reading the section on timing, I realized that time literally moves differently in this legal code depending on your zip code. The rules change based on urban density.
It's a fascinating bit of urban planning baked directly into religious jurisprudence. Let's lay out the baseline first. The text says the window for performing the sacrifice opens at dawn on the day of sacrifice.
That seems simple enough. Dawn breaks, the sun comes up, the holiday begins, you are legally clear to proceed.
Ah, but that is only universally true if you are looking at the sky. If you look at the ground and you realize you are standing inside city limits, everything changes.
Right. The text creates a massive hardline legal distinction between city dwellers, which they call the Misri, and rural dwellers, the people of the Sawad, the agricultural lands and villages.
If you live in the city, the text explicitly and strictly forbids you from performing your sacrifice immediately when dawn breaks. You are legally required to wait.
Wait for what?
You must wait until the local imam completely finishes leading the massive congregational Eid prayer in the main city mosque or the central square. Only after he concludes the prayer are you legally permitted to begin.
But the rural folks, the farmers out in the scattered villages.
They face no such restriction. The moment the first light of dawn cracks the horizon, they can begin their sacrifice immediately. No waiting for a sermon, no waiting for a congregation.
Okay, I have to ask, what is the rationale here? Why the blatant double standard? Why does a farmer get to finish his chores at 6 a.m. while the city merchant has to wait around until mid-morning?
It comes down to prioritizing communal obligations over individual actions and managing the logistics of large populations.
Explain that.
In the city, the defining event of the morning, the anchor of the entire holiday, is the congregational Eid prayer. It is a massive, unified civic and spiritual gathering. The prophet established a very strict procedural order for the day. Our first rite on this day is the prayer, then the sacrifice.
And the text is incredibly serious about this order. It notes that if a city person jumps the gun, ignores the rule, and sacrifices their animal before the imam finishes the prayer, that sacrifice is legally void.
They literally have to go buy another animal and do it over again. Whoever slaughters a sheep before the prayer, let him repeat his sacrifice.
Right, and the jurists explain the practical reasoning behind this strictness. Think about the physical reality of processing livestock. It is messy, it is exhausting, it takes time.
A lot of time.
If you allowed tens of thousands of city dwellers to slaughter right at dawn, what would happen? They would get caught up in the work, they'd be covered in blood, their clothes would be ruined, they would be distracted by butchering the meat, and as a result, a massive portion of the city would likely miss the congregational prayer entirely.
The communal unity would completely fracture.
Exactly. So the law artificially delays their window of action to ensure that the entire community remains physically and spiritually unified in the central square for the prayer first. The prayer takes precedence.
But why doesn't that logic apply to the rural areas? Why don't they have to wait for a prayer?
Because in this specific legal tradition, the Hanafi school, the massive congregational Eid prayers, much like the Friday congregational prayers, are legally required to be held only in major cities or substantial towns that possess a formal imam, a civic leader, and the necessary infrastructure.
So the scattered agrarian villages literally don't hold these massive formal prayers.
Correct. They might pray individually or in small groups, but they don't have the grand civic congregation that defines the city. Therefore, since there is no massive civic event for them to be distracted from, the legal reason for the delay doesn't exist.
And when the reason for a restriction disappears, the restriction disappears.
The law defaults back to the natural start time, the breaking of dawn.
It is such a pragmatic, functional approach to managing a society. But as logical as it is, this urban-rural divide creates a situation that had me literally laughing out loud when I read it. Because where there is a strict rule, there is always a wealthy person looking for a legal loophole.
Ah, yes. The geographical loophole.
It is the medieval equivalent of a corporate tax haven. Okay, let's paint the picture. Let's say I'm a wealthy merchant living in the heart of the city. I have my beautiful sheep tied up in my courtyard, but I am impatient. I really, really don't want to wait until 10 a.m. after the imam finishes his incredibly long sermon. I want to get my religious duty done at 6 a.m. so I can get on with my day.
And the text provides you with a completely legal trick.
It does. It provides a formal legal stratagem. The text explicitly states the stratagem for the city dweller, if he wants to hasten it, is to send it, the animal, outside the city so it can be sacrificed as soon as dawn breaks.
I mean, come on. That is exactly like a CEO sitting in a skyscraper in Manhattan, but legally registering his shell corporation in Delaware so he doesn't have to pay New York taxes.
It is.
I am sitting in my city townhouse drinking coffee while my sheep is physically outsourced to a suburban field just past the city limits so it can bypass the city's time regulations.
It absolutely sounds like a sneaky corporate maneuver, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But before you judge the jurist for allowing a rich man's loophole, you have to understand the deep structural legal consistency at play here.
Okay, I'll bite. Defend the loophole. How is it not just a hypocritical bypass of their own strict rule?
Because the jurists were forced to answer a fundamental question of property law. When a law regulates an asset, does the rule attach to the physical location of the owner, or does it attach to the physical location of the asset itself?
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where this is going.
To answer that, they didn't just guess. They looked for precedent in other areas of their legal code. They looked at zakat, the obligatory annual tax on wealth and livestock. Imagine a wealthy merchant who lives in a palace in Cairo. But his wealth isn't in gold. It's in massive herds of sheep that are physically grazing hundreds of miles away in the distant countryside.
Right.
When it comes time to assess the tax, which rules apply? The rules of Cairo, where the owner sits, or the rules of the countryside, where the sheep are eating grass? The established legal precedent determined that the rules apply based on the location of the asset. The property itself is the subject of the law, not the owner's armchair.
So they took that exact precedent and copy-pasted it onto the sacrifice.
Precisely. The physical animal is the asset being regulated by the timing rules. If the animal is physically standing in a rural field, a place where the wait for the imam's prayer rule legally does not exist, then that animal can be sacrificed at dawn. It does not matter if the guy holding the receipt for the animal is sitting in a coffee shop next to the main city mosque.
The text actually spells this out. It says, what is considered in this is the place of the sacrifice, meaning the animal, not the place of the sacrificer.
Yes. It maintains absolute logical consistency across different domains of property law. It might look like a convenient trick to us, but to the jurists, it was just the rigorous, uncompromising application of their own definitions of jurisdiction.
It's brilliant. It's a cohesive legal matrix. And speaking of the physical animal, that takes us to the next massive layer of regulation in our sources. We know who is doing it, we know when they're doing it, and where. But the what, the physical condition of the animal itself, has to pass an inspection that makes modern FDA standards look relaxed.
The aesthetic and biological requirements are incredibly rigorous.
And exploring these biological rules reveals a profound double standard in the law that, surprisingly, acts as a massive protection for the most vulnerable people in society. But let's start with the baseline physical standards. You can't just grab any old sick animal out of the barn.
No. The underlying philosophy here is that you are presenting a symbolic offering to the divine. It is an act of reverence. You do not show reverence by offering up your broken, useless, dying cast-offs. The animal must possess a fundamental level of quality and health.
The text lays out a strict list of physical defects that completely invalidate an animal for sacrifice based on a quote from the prophet. 4 do not suffice in sacrifices: the clearly one-eyed, the clearly lame, the clearly sick, and the emaciated one that has no marrow.
It's very practical. It can't be blind. It can't be hobbling so badly that it literally cannot walk itself to the site of the slaughter. And it cannot be starving to the point where its bones are hollow.
But the jurists being jurists, they don't just stop at clearly one-eyed. They get deep into the weeds on the physical measurements. For example, what happens if an animal isn't entirely blind, or missing an entire ear, but just missing part of its ear or part of its tail?
Yes. The great medieval debate over fractions.
It really is. The text establishes a general rule. If an animal is missing most of its ear or tail, it is invalid. But how do you legally define most? Because if you leave that up to individual judgment, you'll have endless arguments at the market.
And this is where we see another fascinating split between Abu Hanifa and his students.
Abu Hanifa says that if an animal is missing exactly 1/3 of its ear, it crosses the threshold. It is invalid. But his top students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, say no, 1/3 is fine. It has to be missing more than a half to be considered most.
What is truly captivating here isn't the fraction itself, but how Abu Hanifa arrived at his fraction of 1/3. Because he didn't just pull that number out of thin air. He looked to an entirely different, seemingly unrelated field of law to find a precedent for defining a legally significant amount.
I couldn't believe this when I read it. Where did he find the number?
He pulled it from inheritance law and the rules governing last wills and testaments.
Wait, really? What does a sheep's ear have to do with drafting a will? That sounds like using tax brackets to determine a speeding ticket.
It's all about how the legal system defines a critical mass of a whole. In Islamic inheritance law, there is a very strict rule. A person can only will away a maximum of 1/3 of their total estate to non-heirs or charities without needing the explicit permission of their legal heirs. The remaining 2/3 are mathematically locked in for the family.
Okay, I follow.
The rationale in inheritance law is that 1/3 represents a significant, life-altering, substantial amount of the total whole. Once you hit 1/3, you have critically impacted the core entity. Therefore, Abu Hanifa takes that conceptual definition of substantial impact and imports it directly onto the anatomy of the livestock. If 1/3 of the ear is gone, a legally significant critical portion is gone. The animal is defective.
That is wild. He cross-pollinated the philosophical metrics of human inheritance with the biological metrics of livestock.
He did. It shows how deeply interconnected he viewed the entire legal universe. But his students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, look at this interdisciplinary gymnastics and basically say, you are overthinking this.
They bring it back to reality.
Yes. They argue that this isn't an abstract legal philosophy about estates. It's about physical reality and common sense language. In the physical, material world, the word most means the majority. And the majority means more than half. If 51% of the ear is missing, it's invalid. If 49% is missing, it's valid.
It's like arguing whether a hot dog is a sandwich. Are we using structural, abstract definitions or practical, cultural definitions?
Exactly. And to show you how rigorous they were about physical reality, the text even details a medieval optometry test.
Oh, I love this part.
If an animal has a partially clouded eye, and the buyer and seller are arguing over whether it has lost 1/3 of its vision or a half, the text provides a scientific procedure. You tie up the animal's good eye. You withhold food from it. Then you place food at a distance and slowly move it closer. You measure the exact distance at which the animal finally reacts and sees the food, compared to the distance a healthy eye sees, and use the ratio to calculate the exact percentage of vision loss.
They were doing clinical trials in the sheep pen. Okay, but amidst all this rigorous biological measurement, the text does point out exceptions. Some conditions, which might seem like defects to us, are totally legally fine.
Yes. For example, an animal without horns is perfectly valid. The lack of horns doesn't affect the meat or the vitality of the animal.
A castrated animal is not only fine, but the text notes its meat is actually considered better and more tender, and there is precedent that the prophet explicitly chose castrated rams for sacrifice.
My personal favorite, even an animal that is slightly crazy, what the text calls thala, is allowed.
I laughed at that. A crazy sheep is fine, with one crucial caveat.
As long as it still eats. The text is ruthlessly practical here. If the animal's neurological issue makes it wander around aimlessly but it still puts its head down and grazes, it's valid. But if its craziness causes it to stop eating, then it eventually becomes emaciated. And emaciation, as we established, is a strictly invalidating defect.
Pragmatism above all. And there are also strict age rules for the animals. 5 years old for a camel, 2 years old for a cow, 1 full year for a sheep or goat.
But there is a famous, heavily utilized exception here regarding the sheep. The 6-month-old sheep, known as the jada.
Yes, the text allows you to use a 6-month-old sheep, but only under a very specific optical illusion.
It must be so unusually large, fat, and robust for its age that if you released it into a flock of full-year-old sheep, a person looking from a distance couldn't tell the difference.
Again, it's about the physical reality trumping the strict calendar date. If it looks mature and has the meat of a mature animal, the exact birth certificate can be fudged a bit. But, okay, here we go. This is the most crucial, beautiful, and complex part of this entire section on physical defects, the rich versus poor discrepancy.
This is where the law reveals its profound heart and its deep understanding of economic vulnerability.
I want to build out the scenario exactly as the text implies it because the tension here is incredible. Imagine 2 men live on the same street. One is a wealthy merchant. The other is a desperately poor laborer. Both of them go to the market on the same day.
The wealthy man goes because he is legally obligated to. The poor man goes because, even though he is legally exempt due to his poverty, he wants the spiritual reward. He has scraped together his meager savings for months.
Exactly. They both purchase a perfectly healthy, flawless, legally valid sheep. They bring them home and tie them up in their respective front yards. That night, a pack of wild dogs gets into the neighborhood. Both sheep are attacked. Both sheep suffer a severely broken leg. They are now hobbling and clearly lame.
Which means, according to the stripped list of defects we just discussed, both of those animals are now legally invalid for sacrifice.
Right. They're damaged goods. Morning comes. The 2 men walk out and see their broken sheep. What does the law dictate they must do next?
The law treats them entirely, radically differently. Let's look at the wealthy merchant first. The law says to him, your sheep is invalid. You cannot use it. You must go back to the market, spend your money a second time, and buy a brand new, healthy, flawless sheep to perform your sacrifice. He is held to a standard of strict liability.
Ouch. He has to eat the cost of the first sheep and buy a second one.
Now look at the poor laborer. The law says to him, your sheep is broken. It is legal defective. However, you may go ahead and sacrifice that broken-legged sheep, and your spiritual obligation is completely fulfilled.
Hold on. I have to push back hard here. How is that justice? They both have a broken sheep. The physical reality of the animal's leg is identical in both yards. We just spent 20 minutes talking about how strict the rules are about fractions of ears and cloudy eyes. How can the law justify 2 completely different rulings for the exact same physical defect?
It seems like a blatant contradiction, doesn't it? But it isn't. To understand the genius of this ruling, you have to look past the physical sheep and look at the invisible legal mechanism of how an obligation attaches to a person.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics.
Let's recall Section 1. Why did the wealthy man buy a sheep in the first place? Because his wealth triggered a general legal obligation. He owes a debt to the divine law to provide a valid sacrifice. Any valid sacrifice.
Right. His obligation is tied to his status as a rich guy.
Yes. When he went to the market and bought that first sheep, he was merely acquiring an asset to pay his general debt. The debt itself wasn't tied to that specific animal. That animal was just the currency he planned to use. When that sheep broke its leg, his currency became void. But his underlying general debt did not disappear. He still owes the law a healthy sheep. Therefore, He must buy another one.
That makes painful logical sense for the rich guy. What about the poor man?
Why did the poor man buy a sheep? He is poor. He doesn't meet the Sadaquad outfit or wealth threshold. The law asks absolutely nothing of him. He's entirely exempt. He has no general debt to the divine law.
Right.
However, the moment he took his meager savings, went to the market, and voluntarily purchased that specific sheep with the explicit intention of sacrificing it for God, he created an obligation out of thin air.
He volunteered for duty.
Exactly. And here's the masterpiece of legal equity. Because his obligation only exists by his own voluntary act of dedicating that specific physical animal, his obligation attaches strictly and exclusively to that specific animal. He never owed a general debt to the universe. He only owes what he pointed at and volunteered.
Oh, wow.
So if the specific asset he volunteered gets injured, well, that's the asset he owes. He owes the sheep in his yard. If the sheep in his yard has a broken leg, he sacrifices a sheep with a broken leg. The law says his obligation is fulfilled because he delivered the exact, specific item he promised in whatever state it happens to be in.
That is breathtaking. The law recognizes that if it forced a poor person who already went above and beyond to participate to go buy a second animal, it would completely bankrupt them. It would turn a beautiful act of spiritual devotion into a catastrophic financial penalty.
It would punish piety. So the jurists use the highly technical, abstract mechanics of how contracts and obligations form to weave a protective shield around the poorest members of society. They hold the wealthy to the fire of general liability, but give the poor a built-in grace period based on specific liability.
It's not blind justice. It's incredibly observant justice. It flexes depending on the financial weight it is placing on the shoulders of the individual.
It is istisan at its most compassionate, operating silently within the gears of Kias.
Which brings us to our final major theme in this text. We've talked about the obligation, buying the animal, sharing the animal, the geography, and the physical state of the animal. But what happens after the act is done?
Right. Once the sacrifice is complete, the spiritual act is over, but you are left with a very physical reality. Hundreds of pounds of meat, bones, and a large hide.
And how the jurists govern this leftover material shows a massive, impenetrable boundary between the realm of worship and the realm of capitalism. I call this section Anti-Commercialization and the Law of Mistaken Identity.
The primary directive for the leftover material is highly communal. The text explicitly recommends dividing the meat into thirds.
A very balanced approach. Eat 1/3 with your immediate family to celebrate, store 1/3 for your family's future consumption, and give the final third away to the poor and destitute as charity.
It ensures that the holiday results in a massive redistribution of high-quality food throughout the city. But the text is fiercely, almost aggressively protective of the non-commercial nature of this meat.
Right. The jurors seem terrified that this sacred ritual will quietly devolve into a backdoor business transaction. The core unbreakable principle they lay down is you cannot derive any worldly financial profit or offset any commercial expenses using an asset that was consecrated to God.
And they provide very specific, everyday examples to enforce this. The most prominent one is paying the butcher.
Let's say I'm wealthy, but I don't know the first thing about butchering a cow. So I hire a professional butcher to slaughter, skin, and quarter the animal for me. The text says I cannot pay him for his labor by giving him a leg of the meat or the skin of the animal as his wage.
Correct. They cite a direct command from the prophet to his cousin Ali, who was managing the sacrifices. Do not give the butcher his wage from it.
But why? If I'm supposed to give meat away anyway, why can't I just give it to the guy holding the knife?
Because paying a wage is not an act of charity, it is a binding commercial exchange. You are buying his time and labor. If you give him the meat in exchange for that labor, you are essentially selling consecrated meat to save yourself the out-of-pocket cost of his wages. You are profiting financially by avoiding a bill. That introduces commerce into the consecration, which invalidates the purity of the offering.
So the law forces me to reach into my other pocket and pay him with regular secular cash. The meat remains entirely outside the economy.
Exactly. And the rules around the animal's skin are incredibly granular to enforce this same principle. A large cowhide is a valuable commodity. But the text says you cannot sell the skin to buy consumable goods.
Right. It gives examples. You can't take the skin to the market and trade it for a jug of vinegar or spices or groceries.
Because what happens to vinegar and spices? You eat them, they disappear. If you trade the skin for food, you have essentially converted the consecrated skin into a consumable asset for your own worldly enjoyment. You've eaten the value of the skin. It's treating a sacred object like everyday currency.
But the text isn't entirely wasteful. It does allow you to use the skin.
Yes, provided the skin retains its physical permanence as an object of utility rather than an object of consumption. You can tan it and use it to make a household item. A water skin, a leather bag, a sieve, a prayer rug. You can benefit from its utility, but you cannot consume its value.
And if you really don't want a new leather bag,
You can take the skin to the market, sell it for cash, but, and this is a massive but, you must immediately take 100% of that cash and give it to the poor as charity. You act merely as an agent transferring the value from the sacred realm to the destitute. You cannot keep a single coin.
it is a hermetic seal against profiteering. But amidst all these strict rules governing meat and hide, the text presents a final scenario that is perhaps the most mind-bending, almost sitcom-esque legal crisis in the entire book.
Ah, the case of mistaken identity.
This is the ultimate showdown between Kia's strict analogy and Istasan equity. It is the grand finale of our deep dive.
Set the stage for us.
Okay, picture this. Two neighbors. Let's call them neighbor A and neighbor B. They live next door to each other in a crowded city. They both go to the market, and they both buy identical-looking, perfectly healthy white sheep for the sacrifice.
A common occurrence.
They bring them home, and because space is tight, they tie them both up in a shared communal courtyard between their houses. Morning comes, the sun rises, the imam finishes the prayer. It's chaotic, there's noise, there are animals everywhere. Neighbor A walks out into the courtyard, grabs a white sheep, sacrifices it, and processes it. Neighbor B walks out, grabs the remaining white sheep, sacrifices it, and processes it.
And then the dust settles.
And then they look closely at the markings on the hides.
They swapped animals.
Exactly. Neighbor A accidentally slaughtered neighbor B's sheep, and neighbor B accidentally slaughtered neighbor A's sheep. It is a complete, well-intentioned mess. What does the strict law, our old friend Kias, say about this absolute disaster?
The strict analogy, again championed by the rigorous jurist Zufar, is brutal. Kias strips away all the context of the holiday and looks only at the raw mechanics of property law. He says, you just destroyed another man's private property without his explicit permission. Legally, according to strict analogy, you are a usurper. You committed a tort. You are guilty of property destruction. Therefore, neighbor A owes neighbor B the full financial value of the destroyed sheep and damages, and neighbor B owes neighbor A the same.
They sue each other.
But it gets worse.
Mm-hmm.
Because you slaughtered an animal that you did not legally own, you had no legal jurisdiction to consecrate it to God. You cannot give away what isn't yours. Therefore, neither sacrifice counts.
That is devastating. You're treating a neighborly mix-up like Grand Theft Auto. It's like accidentally driving off in someone else's identical rental car from the airport lot, and when you bring it back, the agency says, you stole a car, pay us 30 grand, and by the way, your entire vacation is legally void.
To the blind letter of the law, it is grand theft. The logic is consistent, but practically, it is a nightmare that ruins a joyous holiday, voids two sincere acts of worship, and pits neighbors against each other in court over an honest mistake.
Thank goodness for Istasan, because the majority of the Hanafi scholars look at Zufar's ruling and step in to stop the madness.
They deploy juristic equity. They overrule the strict tort law.
What is their final ruling?
They rule that the sacrifice is completely valid for both neighbors, their spiritual obligation is fulfilled, and nobody owes anybody a single dime in damages.
I am so relieved. But wait, legally, how do they justify just ignoring the destruction of private property? You can't just wave a magic wand and say, property rights don't matter today.
They don't wave a wand.
Mm.
They introduce a highly nuanced legal concept, implicit permission based on context.
Walk me through that.
The jurists zoom out and look at the broader picture. Both of these identical animals were already designated for the exact same purpose. They were both destined to be sacrificed on the exact same day, in the exact same location. Furthermore, both owners possessed the correct spiritual intention in their hearts when they wielded the knife.
Right. Neither of them was trying to steal a meal.
Exactly. The jurists argued that by bringing these specific sheep to the communal slaughter site on the specific day of sacrifice, there's an implicit customary permission granted among the believers. The context screams that the goal is the act of worship, not the hoarding of an asset. They basically say, look, the sheep was destined to die for God today anyway. The ultimate goal was achieved. Punishing them for crossing wires during a chaotic moment defeats the spirit of the law and creates unnecessary enmity.
It's a beautiful, profoundly human moment. They prioritize the spirit of the action over the rigid mathematical letter of property law. They recognize that human error isn't the same as malicious theft.
And the text doesn't just stop at the sheep. To prove that this isn't just a one-off excuse, the author provides a rapid-fire list of other incredible Istasan rulings from everyday life to hammer home the point.
Give me an example.
The text says, imagine someone comes into your yard and uses your firewood to cook your meat for you without asking. Or they take your raw wheat and grind it into flour for you without asking.
Technically, they altered my property without consent.
Yes. Strict Kia says they destroyed the physical form of your wood and your wheat, so they are usurpers and they owe you damages. But Istisan says, are you kidding? They cooked your dinner, they improved your situation based on common social habits, therefore, under equity, there is no penalty.
It's the no harm, no foul legal doctrine. It's the law recognizing that humans live in a messy, interconnected, well-meaning society. If we strictly, ruthlessly penalized every minor technical violation of property bounds, when the intent was benign or mutually beneficial, society would completely grind to a halt in endless litigation.
It is the ultimate triumph of human pragmatism over robotic logic.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible text, and really to a profound realization about the journey we've just been on.
Let's summarize what we've actually seen here.
We started by looking at a text that, on its surface, is just a dusty manual about animal sacrifice. We thought it was going to be a butcher's guide, but what we found is a highly developed, incredibly sophisticated, internally consistent legal universe. We saw how it balances terrifyingly strict textual warnings, like banning people from the prayer place, with immense practical flexibility.
We saw how it navigates the constant friction between individual rights and communal obligations, from exempting vulnerable travelers who don't have access to their liquid wealth, to building a massive legal firewall to protect the assets of minors from religious depletion.
We look at the extreme fragility of shared intention, where one guy's desire for a brisket can derail a 7-person spiritual joint venture because you can't prorate a consecration. And we saw the brilliant geographical loophole that treats the location of an asset differently than the location of its owner using property tax precedent.
And perhaps most movingly, we saw a legal system that deliberately, structurally builds in a grace period for the poorest members of society, allowing them to fulfill their duty with a defective animal, while holding the wealthy to the fire of strict liability.
It all comes back to that tension we talked about at the very beginning of the hour. The muddy waters of human existence. The jurists here aren't acting like engineers looking at a clean X-ray. They are acting like master navigators. They are steering a massive ship between the jagged, unyielding rocks of rigid analogy, Kias, and the deep, accommodating, sometimes unpredictable waters of human equity, Istisasan.
And that leaves us with a fascinating final thought to consider, especially as we look at how we govern our own lives today. In our modern legal systems, whether we're talking about corporate law, criminal justice, contract disputes, or even the algorithms that increasingly govern our digital lives, we constantly struggle with the rigid letter of the law, punishing people unfairly. We see people caught on technicalities. We see mandatory minimums that destroy lives over minor infractions. Think about the concept of Istisan we explored today, the radical idea of equity explicitly and legally overriding strict precedent because it causes undue hardship.
Right.
As we move toward a future where laws might be applied by AI or where bureaucracy becomes even more rigid, if modern courts allowed human judges to bypass strict laws simply because it causes undue hardship, would our society be more just, more merciful, and more human? Or, without the strict anchor of Charis, would it just become chaotic, subjective, and prone to the whims of the judge?
It's the ultimate balancing act, and it's something to think deeply about the next time you are forced to blindly click agree on the fine print.
What a question. Can we handle the muddy waters of equity, or do we desperately need the comfort of the broken X-ray machine? That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the brilliance of classical jurisprudence. Keep questioning the rules, look for the equity in the fine print, and we'll see you next time.